For years, Céline Dion had an explanation ready. A difficult night, a voice that was not cooperating, a show that had to be changed, sometimes an illness, sometimes exhaustion. To the audience, these were the kinds of things that happen when a singer has spent decades asking almost impossible things of her body. But there was something else happening, and this is where the story becomes more complicated than the headline. Céline did not spend 17 years secretly knowing she had stiff person syndrome and deliberately hiding the diagnosis. She didn't have that answer yet. What she was hiding, or perhaps more accurately, managing in private, were symptoms she could not properly explain. That distinction matters, because imagine living inside a body that is beginning to behave differently, while doctors are looking at the very instrument that made you famous and telling you that they cannot find the obvious problem. She has traced the beginning back to around 2008. She was on her Taking Chances world tour when her voice started doing strange things. It could suddenly rise, it could spasm. For a singer whose entire career had been built on extraordinary control, this was not a small inconvenience. She went to specialists. Her vocal cords were examined, and according to Dion, they appeared healthy. So she kept going. That detail stays with me, because when people look back at Céline from that period, they see the gowns, the enormous stages, the effortless high notes. They see control. She remembers something else, uncertainty. And once you know that, some of those old performances feel different, not because every gesture suddenly becomes evidence of illness. It would be unfair to rewrite her entire career that way. But because we now know there were moments when the woman standing under those lights was quietly trying to understand why the body she had trusted for decades was no longer completely predictable. Then other symptoms appeared: muscle stiffness, difficulty walking. At times, she would hold on to things for support, yet she continued performing, continued touring, continued being Céline Dion, the person audiences expected to walk onto a stage and somehow make everything look easy. And maybe that expectation is part of this story too. Famous people become strangely fixed in our minds. We remember them at their strongest, their healthiest, their most glamorous. When something starts changing behind the curtain, the public usually sees the cancellation before it sees the fear. Céline later acknowledged that there were occasions when she found ways to work around problems with her voice. In her documentary, she described moments when she would turn the microphone toward the audience, or even make it seem as though the microphone itself was responsible when her voice was failing her. Think about that for a second. Thousands of people singing back to her may have believed they were simply participating in the show. Sometimes they may actually have been helping her through it. That part is easy to miss. By 2020, the world stopped. The pandemic brought touring to a halt, and for Céline, that forced pause became something else, an opportunity to stop pushing through and seriously search for an answer. She has described those previous years almost like a game of hide-and-seek with herself, her family, and the people around her. Eventually, she decided she could no longer simply be brave. She needed to understand what was happening. The answer finally came in 2022. Stiff person syndrome, a rare neurological disorder associated with severe muscle stiffness and painful spasms. 17 years. That is the number making headlines now. But perhaps the more unsettling question isn't why Céline Dion kept going for so long. It's how many times millions of us watched her keep going and never realized she was struggling at all. The diagnosis gave Céline Dion something she had been searching for a very long time: a name. But a name does not automatically make suffering easier. In some ways, it can make everything more real. For years, she had been dealing with frightening changes in her body without fully understanding why they were happening. Once doctors identified stiff person syndrome, the uncertainty changed shape. Now there was an explanation, but there was also the knowledge that this was not simply exhaustion, a vocal problem, or something that could be fixed by taking a few weeks away from the stage. And this is where the public story became painfully different from the private one. Most fans remember December 2022, because that was when Céline finally spoke openly about her condition. She appeared in a video, looking directly into the camera. There was no enormous stage behind her, no orchestra, no glamorous entrance, just Céline. And for someone whose career had always depended on control, she was admitting that control had become difficult. Her voice cracked with emotion as she explained that the spasms affected many aspects of her daily life, sometimes even making it difficult to walk and preventing her from singing the way she had always sung. That last part mattered, maybe more than people realized, because singing was never merely Céline Dion's profession. For decades, it had been the language through which she understood herself. Take away the lights and the costumes, and the voice was still there, until suddenly she could no longer completely trust it. There is a tendency when celebrities become ill to focus immediately on the cancelled concerts, the tour dates, the money, whether they will return. But I think that misses something. Imagine waking up and discovering that something you have done almost instinctively since childhood now requires calculation. Breathing, standing, moving, using your voice. Things most people never think about until the body forces them to. Céline later offered an even more disturbing glimpse into that reality when she allowed cameras into moments that most performers would have protected from public view. In I Am Céline Dion, audiences saw her endure an intense physical episode related to her condition. Her body stiffened, medical staff attended to her. She cried. It wasn't glamorous, and that may be precisely why the moment affected so many people. There was something almost uncomfortable about watching it, because this was a woman audiences had spent decades seeing command enormous arenas, suddenly unable to command her own muscles. Yet there is another detail worth noticing. She allowed the scene to remain in the documentary. Think about that. After years of finding ways to conceal what was happening, she eventually chose to show one of the moments when she had the least control. That isn't a small transformation. The earlier Céline protected the performance. The later Céline began protecting the truth. And perhaps that is what these 17 years were really leading toward. Not some dramatic confession that she had deceived everyone. The reality is much more human than that. She was trying to function before she understood what she was fighting. Then, once she understood, she had to decide how much of that struggle she was willing to let the world see. Fans saw cancelled dates. Her family saw something else. They saw the woman when there was no applause. They saw rehabilitation, treatments, exercises, fatigue, and the difficult process of learning what her body could still do. And Céline kept working. Not toward recreating the woman she had been in 1997. That would be the obvious narrative. Instead, she began trying to understand the woman she could still become. There is an important difference, because eventually a question started following every update about Céline Dion. Would she ever sing publicly again? For a while, nobody could answer it, not even Céline. But behind closed doors, something was beginning to happen, slowly, painfully. A voice the world feared it might never hear again was trying to find its way back. For a long time, Céline Dion's comeback was spoken about almost like a question nobody wanted to answer too confidently. Could she still do it? Not record a message from home, not appear briefly at an awards show, not stand beside other musicians while the audience applauded. Could she actually sing again? That distinction matters, because by then, people had seen enough of her illness to understand that this wasn't simply a performer recovering from a bad year. Stiff person syndrome had affected the very mechanics Céline depended on. Her muscles, her breathing, her movement, her ability to control a voice that had once seemed almost impossibly reliable. So when she began rebuilding, she wasn't just rehearsing songs, she was retraining her body. Physical therapy became part of her routine. Vocal exercises did too. In her more recent preparations, she has also spoken about Pilates, ballet, and continued medical treatment as part of the work required to perform again. That sounds almost ordinary when you list it that way. Therapy, exercise, medication, practice. But there is nothing ordinary about having to consciously rebuild abilities that once happened without thought. And I think that's the part of Céline's return that gets lost when people call it a comeback. Comeback is a glamorous word. It sounds like spotlights and applause. Recovery is quieter. Recovery is repetition. Doing the same movement again because yesterday your body wouldn't cooperate. Trying a note and stopping. Starting again. Discovering that determination doesn't automatically override biology. Céline has never pretended otherwise. Then came July 26, 2024. Paris. The Olympic opening ceremony was reaching its final moments when Céline appeared high above the city at the Eiffel Tower. For millions of viewers, the significance was immediate. She sang Edith Piaf's L'Hymne à l'amour. It was her first live performance since March 2020, but watch what happened around the performance. People weren't merely reacting to a song. They were reacting to the fact that she was there at all. That tells you something. Before her illness became public, the audience expected Céline Dion to sing brilliantly. That was the baseline. Excellence was normal. Now, simply seeing her stand there carried an entirely different emotional weight. The standard had changed, and perhaps Céline had changed with it. For decades, perfection had been part of her identity. Huge notes, immaculate gowns, precision, control. Paris wasn't compelling because the public had forgotten she could sing. It was compelling because everyone knew there had been a period when she wasn't certain she could return to that place. That's a very different kind of applause. And yet here's where the story becomes more interesting. The Olympics were not the ending. It would have been easy to turn that performance into a perfect final scene. Céline returns, sings above Paris, proves everyone wrong, fades into legend. Beautiful. Also incomplete. Because living with a chronic neurological condition doesn't obey movie endings. After the applause, there was still treatment, still rehabilitation, still uncertainty. And now in 2026, Céline is preparing for something significantly more demanding than one carefully planned performance. She has announced a major run of shows in Paris beginning in September, with additional performances planned beyond that. In her latest interview, she described wanting to reconnect with the fans she has missed, and emphasized how much work has gone into becoming strong enough to perform again. That changes how I see the 17-year revelation. At first, it sounds like a story about concealment. What did Céline hide? But perhaps the bigger story is what she spent all those years normalizing. Pain, strange symptoms, workarounds, the pressure to continue. You can hide something intentionally, but you can also become so accustomed to surviving it that survival itself starts looking normal. And now Céline is doing almost the opposite. She's naming it, showing it, talking about what it took from her, then walking back toward the stage anyway. Not because the illness disappeared, that's important, but because after years of trying to hide what her body was doing, she no longer seems interested in pretending the struggle isn't part of the performance. There is a strange thing about Céline Dion's story now. The closer she gets to returning, the less convincing the old idea of getting back to normal becomes, because normal is gone, and maybe that isn't entirely bad. For years, Céline's career was built around an almost impossible level of reliability. You bought a ticket, she appeared. You expected the note, she delivered it. Night after night, city after city. That consistency became part of her legend, but it may also have made it easier to miss what was happening underneath. In her newest interview, Céline described the years before her diagnosis in far more physical terms than many people understood at the time. There were moments when pain interfered with walking. There were periods when medication became necessary simply to function. The symptoms were not an occasional inconvenience sitting beside a glamorous career. They were gradually invading ordinary life. And yet she continued. That is usually presented as courage. I'm not sure it's that simple. Sometimes continuing is courage. Sometimes continuing is fear. Sometimes you keep working because stopping would force you to acknowledge something you aren't ready to understand. Céline herself has spoken about how difficult it became to keep explanations going while she still had no proper answer for what was happening. And if you've ever watched someone who has spent a lifetime being dependable, you may recognize that instinct. You don't want to become the person everyone worries about. So you say you're fine. You change the subject. You make the next appointment. You get through the day, then you do it again. That pattern can last much longer than anyone expects. 17 years in her case. But the Céline preparing to return now sounds different. She isn't presenting herself as cured. That part deserves attention. The temptation around celebrity recovery stories is to turn improvement into a miracle. Illness appears. The star fights, triumphant music plays, and suddenly everything is behind them. That's not what she is saying. Her preparation for performing again includes medication, physical therapy, vocal work, Pilates, and ballet. She is still managing the condition while preparing her body for the demands of a concert stage. There is something more compelling about that than a miracle story, because it means the victory isn't that the problem vanished. The victory is that she has learned how to move alongside it, and soon that will be tested in a way it hasn't been since her diagnosis. Beginning in September 2026, Céline is scheduled to return to Paris for a major series of concerts, her first sustained run of live shows since stepping away from touring. The official announcement framed the engagement around the songs that have followed her for generations. But those songs will not be exactly the same anymore. How could they be? When she sings about survival now, the audience knows something it didn't know before. When she pauses for breath, people will notice. When she reaches for a difficult note, there may be a tension in the room that never existed before, and I suspect Céline knows that. She has said that returning is partly about gratitude. Her fans gave her a life beyond anything she could have imagined, and she wants to show them that she is still here. That phrase, still here, carries more weight now. Not because Céline Dion disappeared, but because for years, pieces of what she was enduring remained invisible, even while millions of people were looking directly at her. There is another detail I keep coming back to. Céline has 3 sons. After René Angélil died in 2016, she wasn't simply a singer trying to preserve a career. She was also a mother, trying to keep a family moving after an enormous loss. She has credited her sons with giving her strength during her health battle. That changes the picture again. Maybe she wasn't only protecting an audience from the truth, maybe she was protecting a household from more fear. And if that's true, the 17 years stop looking like a celebrity secret. They start looking like something much more familiar. A person carrying more than everyone around her realized, quietly, until quiet was no longer possible. The most revealing part of Céline Dion's story may not be the diagnosis. It may be what happened after she finally stopped hiding how much the illness had changed her. For years, the public saw a performer who seemed larger than life. The gowns, the enormous stages, the controlled voice, the almost impossible professionalism. Everything suggested certainty, but certainty was exactly what she had lost. And now, after all these years, she is no longer trying to recreate the illusion that nothing happened. That may be the biggest change of all. In recent interviews, Céline has been remarkably open about the long period before her diagnosis, describing symptoms that began many years earlier and gradually became harder to explain away. She has spoken about stiffness, spasms, difficulty moving, and the physical effort it took simply to keep functioning while still trying to maintain a career. What strikes me is not just how long it lasted, it is how normal she made it look. That is the part people often misunderstand about suffering. We imagine pain announces itself. We imagine there must be a moment when everyone around you can see it. But sometimes pain becomes routine. You learn where to sit, how to breathe, how to hide a reaction, how to smile when someone asks if you are okay. And eventually, the people around you stop noticing because you have become very good at helping them not notice. Céline was good at that. Maybe too good. For years, she continued giving audiences the version of herself they expected. And because she had always been disciplined, always been strong, people interpreted that strength as proof that nothing serious was wrong. That was the illusion. Not that Céline was pretending to be someone else, but that the woman everyone believed was completely in control was often just trying to get through the next moment. Now, in 2026, that illusion is gone. And oddly enough, her bond with the audience may be stronger because of it. When she returned at the Paris Olympics in 2024, people did not cheer only because she still had the voice. They cheered because they knew what it had cost her to stand there. That difference matters. Before, Céline's greatness came from appearing effortless. Now, part of her greatness comes from allowing the effort to be seen. And that is a much more vulnerable thing. She is now preparing for a sustained return to the stage, with new performances planned in Paris. She has spoken about the work required to make that possible: physical therapy, vocal training, movement work, medication, rebuilding stamina. None of that sounds like a fairy tale recovery, and perhaps that is why it feels more meaningful. She is not saying the illness disappeared. She is saying she has learned how to live with it. There is strength in that, but not the kind of strength people usually celebrate. It is not dramatic, it is repetitive. It is getting up and doing the exercises again. It is accepting that some days will be better than others. It is understanding that the body may set limits, while refusing to let those limits define everything. And when Céline talks about returning to her fans, she does not sound like someone trying to prove she is invincible. She sounds like someone who understands that time has become more precious. That is another thing illness changes. It changes the meaning of ordinary moments. A rehearsal is no longer just rehearsal. A walk across a stage is no longer just a walk. A note held for several seconds can carry years of fear behind it. Maybe that is what people will hear when Céline sings now. Not just the song, the history underneath it. The 17 years when something was wrong and no one had the full answer. The years of excuses, appointments, fear, medication, family, grief, recovery. All of it sitting inside the voice. And there is something else. For a long time, fans asked whether Céline Dion would ever become the woman she used to be. I think that may have been the wrong question. Why should she? The woman she used to be believed she had to keep going no matter what. The woman standing here now seems to understand that stopping, admitting fear and asking for help are not failures. They are survival. Perhaps that is the real thing she revealed after 17 years. Not a secret, not a scandal, not some hidden truth designed for a headline. She revealed how exhausting it can be to look strong for too long. And once you see that, those old performances change slightly. Not because they become sad, because they become more human. Somewhere in those performances was a woman smiling under the lights while quietly wondering what was happening to her body. Now she knows, and the audience knows too. So when Céline Dion walks onto a stage again, there will be no illusion left between them. Maybe that is why the next chapter of her career could feel different from everything that came before. Not bigger, not louder, just more honest. And sometimes, after 17 years of pretending you can carry everything quietly, honesty is the bravest performance you can give.